part of Sri Kalishwari College. Now, I would like to call Mrs. Young Archana Devi, Assistant Professor, to introduce the chief guest.
A fine good morning to all. Once again, we welcome you on this second day of the National Conference on Postmodern Voices and Transdisciplinarity in English Language and Literature. We welcome you all. Before this, starting this session, I would like to give a brief introduction about today's chief guest, Dr. S. Sushma V. Murthy. She is an associate professor at Department of English, Christ, deemed to be University, and she teaches gender studies, post-colonial and world literatures, cultural studies, and British literature. She was affiliated to University of Montreal under the Sastry Doctoral Research Fellowship in 2007 and 8, and secured a doctoral degree in 2014 for her dissertation, The Burnished Phoenix, Lesbian Aesthetics in the Works of Nicole Brazil, from University of Mysore. Her research interests include queer theory and literature, feminist translation studies, psychoanalytical feminism, and trauma narratives by women. Her publications include research articles on feminist translation, transgender aesthetics, and queer theory. Currently, Dr. Sushma V. Murthy ma'am is completing a major research project on select popular fiction of Triveni, a prominent psychoanalytical feminist writer in Canada. The project examines psychocultural aspects of women's mental health disorders with a heightened focus on gendered narrativization of trauma in cases of hysteria. Once again, I welcome you, ma'am. Thank you.
May I begin the session now?
Thank you, ma'am. Postmodern concepts have generated both strong and vehement criticism. From Joyce Perez's Species of Spaces, the discovery of a meaning, the perceiving that the earth is a form of writing, a geography of which we have forgotten that we are the authors. With this, may I call Dr. Sushma V. Murthy, Associate Professor, Department of English and Cultural Studies, Central Campus Christ, deemed to be University Bangalore, to take off the session. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Good morning. I hope you're able to hear me, all of you.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, thank you so much. I wish I was there because I very fondly remember coming to Kalishwari College around the same time, October 2019, I think. And it's really, really nice to be back with you all, although I'm online, and that was my choice because we have the NAC visit happening at the university right now. But, it's always nice to come back to Shivakashi because I have many friends there. And Kalishwari College is a very important part of my academic network. So to begin with, I would like to thank Dr. Femina for inviting me, the principal, the management, and all the faculty members, especially from the Department of English of Kalishwari College. And, on that note, I would like to begin the session. I hope you had a good session, all good sessions yesterday. And I hope that I will be able to add some value and meaning to your understanding of postmodernism and why we, think of it as a very important approach today to both literature and culture. So with your permission, I will begin with the presentation. Okay. I think I do not have screen sharing rights. Can you please give me sharing rights?
Sure, ma'am.
Yeah. So how are you all this morning by the time we start the session? Would you like to, I hope all of you are doing well.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, okay. So please don't look at this as a lecture. This is basically dissemination of information, and we will have some interaction later, okay? It's so nice to see all of you students out there. I hope you're enjoying the conference.
Thank you, ma'am. Nice to see you as well, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Is the sharing, I think I have the sharing rights now. I'll do that. Okay, so are you able to see full screen now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so I have time till 11:30. Is that the time, or because we are starting at 10:15, I think. How much time do I have?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay, so I will try to finish by 11:15 and then we can have an interaction. Okay. And if there's anything that you want me to stop and discuss, I can do that as well. Because you are all in the auditorium, we can't use the chat box. I think most of you are in the auditorium. But then what you could do is you can maybe keep your questions for until later. Those of you who are online can use the chat box. Okay. Yeah. So on that note, I'm very happy to be here talking about an area of interest that is very close to my heart, which is obviously gender studies, and looking at it from a postmodern perspective. And I have titled this presentation Subverses of the Meta. Okay, let me clarify this, and you might have seen that slash between sub and versus. So it is basically a pun on subversion, right? So subversion is a process of going beyond defined boundaries, right? It is a process of transgression. It is a process whereby you question normative ideas, of who you are, what you are, what the world is, and your relationship with the world. So subversion is a very popular term in gender studies, right? Because today we live in a world where we have not only questioned the gender binary, we have also questioned to a large extent institutions surrounding gender. Okay, these could be institutions of science, religion. These could be institutions of society and culture, right? So the idea that today we are looking at gender as identity itself is something that puts the focus on the individual. So that is the whole point of subversion. And I have used sub/verses because I'm looking at literature, right? Basically, that's the term why I use the term verse. Okay, so anything that is sub is under, right? Something that comes below something that is main. I'm sure you've heard of topics and subtopics. So subverses in that sense, also in terms of subversion. Okay, and what is the meta? I will come to that. What are these meta narratives that we are talking about? So we realize that postmodernism is a set of ideological movements, artistic movements, aesthetic positions, and disciplines that actually broke down the boundaries of larger disciplines, which were meta, which were above everything else, right? So that meta means above, right? When we say metaphysical, we say beyond the physical, right? So the idea that there is a knowledge out there which is supreme, a knowledge out there which is completely what you could call as integral, and it contains everything that is supposed to be known, right? So we normally like to think of the world as something that's already there and we are processing the world as individuals, right? But then your own understanding of the world depends on how you interact with the world, right? So there are no disciplines in the world which are meta, which are beyond reality, or which are beyond your own existential interaction with the world. So you see that postmodernism gives you the complete freedom and choice to define your reality on your own terms, and that is the premise for postmodernism. And that is the reason why that doesn't matter what you're looking at as postmodern. It could be a system of thought, it could be an aesthetic practice, it could be postmodern art, it could be postmodern literature. All of these question what we call as the meta, right? And that is the reason why I took up this title. I told Femina the other day that I want to have something creative instead of just calling it transdisciplinary approaches to gender, right? I would like to call it something interesting which captures the essence of what we are talking about when we talk about postmodernism, and that is subversion of whatever is meta, right? Or whatever is given to you as the whole truth, the absolute truth. Okay, so I will talk to you why we are looking at gender through a transdisciplinary lens, because that is also the focus of your conference, right? You're looking at transdisciplinary approaches, transdisciplinary texts, and the transdisciplinary shift in postmodernism, right? So are you all with me? Are you all able to follow what I'm talking about?
Yes, ma'am.
Am I articulate enough, clear enough?
Yes, sure.
Is the speed okay with you, or do I have to slow down a little? Please let me know.
Okay, ma'am.
Right? Is it fine?
Yes, ma'am. We can easily follow you, ma'am.
Okay, thank you so much. I'll go to the next slide. Okay, right. So what is it that we are going to foreground today in today's discussion and presentation? How are we going to look at gender and postmodernism? Postmodernism is huge, right? Because postmodernism is not a school, it is not a movement, it is not an ideology. Postmodernism is an approach, okay, to what we call as knowledge, to what we call as being, what we call as identity, what we call as, say, language, our relationship with the world. So postmodernism is an approach. Please don't look at postmodernism as a school of thought, because you will not find one. And postmodernism does not also have a definition. Okay, so you might find some classical definitions of postmodernism here and there, but then they will not be able to capture the whole essence of postmodernism, because postmodernism is based on not defining something in very rigid terms. So if you're trying to define postmodernism, you will be going against the grain of the very soul of postmodernism, right? But in my own way, I will try to connect, gender with postmodern approaches, or what are the postmodern approaches that we have taken to gender, say from the second half of the 20th century onwards, because you see that the beginnings of what we call as postmodernism, academically, intellectually, philosophically, it begins in the second half of the 20th century, right? So 1960s onwards, there is a shift, right, from modernist approaches to postmodernist approaches. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to foreground certain important debates. I have no claims here, right, that I will be looking at postmodernism in its entirety, because postmodernism is a process that we are still negotiating with. But what I will do is to give you the origins of postmodernism, to give you the basic, what you could call as approaches in postmodernism, and finally to look at the whole idea of gender, right, through postmodern lenses. And what are those lenses? So to begin with, I have a roadmap here for all of us, right? So today we're going to look at, to begin with, the postmodern and the meta. What do we mean by the meta? What do we mean by postmodern, right? And how does this postmodern approach dislocate or locate gender? Again, you see that there is a slash there. This could mean both locating as well as dislocating gender or relocating gender, right? So I'm going to very, very briefly talk to you about how postmodernism has its roots in Immanuel Kant, for example, right? Or Heidegger, for example, right? You can go all the way back to Nietzsche, right, to look at postmodernism or to understand postmodernism, because these were the philosophers, thinkers, who thought about the shifts that were happening in the philosophical, understanding of who the subject is, who the self is, who are we, who am I? Okay, so you will find that the bearings or the roots of postmodernism are in philosophy to a large extent. And you can go back all the way up to Immanuel Kant, right, after the Enlightenment period. And you can go back to Derrida, you can go back to Heidegger, right? I will briefly introduce you to the key, concerns that they look at, which, feed into what we today recognize as postmodernism, okay? Right, so I will be looking at the idea of productive difference, which was actually given by Gilles Deleuze, who is a very important postmodern theorist. I will be asking you also to look at genealogies, which is an idea that was largely popularized by Michel Foucault. But then, of course, he based his entire discourse on genealogy, on the, idea of genealogy by Nietzsche. Right, so you have to go back to Nietzsche to understand genealogy and what Foucault means by genealogy, right? So I will be, asking you to, by the end of the presentation, you will be looking at postmodernity, right, as a condition, right, and postmodernism as an approach to the human condition. And that is the whole idea of this presentation. And who are the human subjects that we are looking at, right? We will be looking at masculinities, femininities. We will be looking at queer, identities as well. Okay, so different kinds of identities across the gender spectrum. Okay, and finally, something that all of you, I'm sure, are able to better relate to than me or some of us in the English departments. That is, all of you who live in the virtual world, right? Who have multiple, planes of existence today, right? Whose transaction with the world is in terms of networking societies, in terms of digital technology. And today we are talking about immersive realities, right? What are immersive realities? So today you don't really look at experience as something that you need to, negotiate with in terms of the external world. So today, that is also called Meta, interestingly, isn't it, right? So you have heard of Facebook and Meta, and you have looked at these devices. You can wear a pair of goggles today, right? And you know that recently we looked at that kind of technology with the introduction of 5G, right? You looked at Narendra Modi, our Prime Minister, wearing those goggles and looking at a different kind of reality, right? So today we talk about immersive realities and how technologies are, able to give you an experience which may not be real or which may not be actual, but something that you can very deeply experience because you are immersed into it through technology, right? So are you all with me? Are you all able to relate to what I'm saying up
Yes,
to this
ma'am.
point? Right.
Yes.
So the postmodern, to a large extent, is also dependent on technological advancements, especially the shift from electronic to digital media, and what Marshall McLuhan called as the digital village, right? The global village was characterized by technology, by media, and most of our realities today are mediatized. They are not just mediated, they are also mediatized, which means that to a large extent, how we understand the world, how we interact with the world, is largely dependent upon what we, see as media, right? As representations of the world through media, right? This could be broadcast media, this could be social media, this could be all forms of digital media that you use on your apps, on your Android or Apple phones, okay? But all of these, right, can be understood by, one term, and that term is cyborg, right? And the cyborg is half human, half animal, half machine, right? You can ask me why, how can it be half when you have three different components? What that simply means is today we live in a world where you are not entirely human. You have never been entirely human in that sense, because we have always been part of the organic ecosystem that we belong to, right? But we are also part of a hyper reality, right, which is beyond what we consider to be the real world. And most of the realities that we negotiate with are mediated by technology, and that is why we use the term hyper reality, we use the term virtual reality, today we use the term immersive reality, and that is gaining very a lot of popularity. And I will introduce you to the concept of cyborgs and how cyborgs negotiate with gender identity. What happens to your gender when you're a cyborg, right? And I will introduce you to Donna Haraway's idea of affinity. And she says affinities are better than identities. I will come to that a little later. But these are some of the important, I could say, approaches in postmodernism, ideologically, philosophically, right, which you could use to interpret literature, or which you could use to understand what is characterized as or identified as postmodern literature. So how do you do a postmodern reading? Right? What is postmodern in that reading, right? These are some of the popular approaches that we have taken to literature, right, in terms of a postmodern reading. Okay. Are you all with me? Shall I go on to the next slide?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So just a minute. Yeah. So I already told you that postmodernism defies definition, right? So if you are even trying to understand what is postmodernism, right, you need to understand this as an approach. So you look at that painting there, right? It is called Snow White, right? And this is a postmodern, piece of art. And you will see that in postmodern art, there is no centrality, there is no origin, or there is no angle of vision which is rooted in one object, right? So you will see that there is a fragmentation, there is a dissolution, there is a decenteredness. And that is the reason why I wanted to bring this to you, right? Because this very perfectly captures the transdisciplinarity of postmodernism, right? So postmodernism, to begin with, is a reaction against modernism and its ideal utopian belief in progress, right? So the idea that we all live in this world, right? And the world should be utopian or idealistic, that the world should be like this or should be like that, right? So for example, if you look at the concept of love, right? So you believe that love should be like this. And we enter into our relationships, or we analyze our relationships based on this notion of love that we have, right? But we know that the experience of love is something that is very subjective, which is very individual, right? Similarly, the notion of truth, right, which is supposed to be absolute, for example, right? Or the notion of time, which is supposed to be linear, okay, or chronological. All of these ideas of a progressive utopian world, right, is very central to the first half of the 20th century. So you look at Expressionism, Impressionism, right? You look at Surrealism, Dadaism, look at some of the movements that happened in the first half of the 20th century. You will see that there is a search for order. There is a search for an ideal progressive understanding of time or of history, right? And why is that? Because the first half of the 20th century was characterized mostly in Europe by the world wars. It was a time of utter chaos. It was a time of utter distability, right? It was a time when neither history nor time nor human experience could be certain or could be understood in very certain terms. So we lived in a very fragile, fragmented world. And that is the reason why in the first half of the 20th century, you have a lot of, for example, science fiction, which is very utopian. There is a need or a quest for, for example, you look at H.G. Wells, who looks at the time machine, right? So there is an understanding that perhaps technology or science or industrialization or something else will help our societies to be more progressive, less destructive, okay? And there is an evolutionary principle, right? There is the Darwinist understanding of the evolution of human life, and that things evolve, that things are progressive, okay? So you have a whole, 2 or 3 centuries of Enlightenment rationalism behind modernism, right? And although the focus is on the individual and the focus is on articulating the concerns of chaos and confusion resulting from the two world wars, you will see that the modernists are very temporal. What we mean by that is modernists are interested in time, in history, in chronology. They are very much, interested in articulating a progressive, understanding of the world. Right? So there is a utopian ideal, there is a progressive notion of the world. But in a postmodernist sense, you see, by the time you come to the 1960s, you realize that this kind of a utopian world, this kind of a progressive world does not actually exist, right? And you will see that there is what we call as a spatial turn, where you move away from the temporality, right, of existence to the spatiality. So that is why today we deal so much with space, right? And we believe that space and time are not inseparable, right? That's why we use the term spatio-temporality or temporal spatiality, right? Or what we call as geopolitics, which means that how you experience the world depends to a large extent on where you are, right? And at what point of time in history you are. And history is no longer a thing of the past. History is something that you experience in a continuum. And this idea of the linear chronology of history becomes outdated. This idea of the absolute truth which you are experiencing in the world, or that there's something out there, something called love, something called meaning, or something called truth, right? That there is something called as knowledge, right? That is absolute and out there, and that you are experiencing it through your senses, is something that becomes outdated. Because what is knowledge? How do you understand the world? You understand the world largely through the imagination of the world. And what is it that helps you to imagine the world? What we call as reality is also imagined, because you need language to process the world, right? And that is why you come to what we call as logocentrism, right? You look at both structuralism and post-structuralism. They look at the mechanics of language, okay? So if you take away language, there is no world, there is no meaning, there is no existence, there is no being, right? So this idea that there is a world out there that has to be understood in specific ways, and that there are knowledge systems which will allow you to understand the world in specific ways, and that they are absolute, right, is something that postmodernism questions, because postmodernism looks at the entire experience of the world and of human being, within quotes, as something that is very subjective and experiential. Right? So how you experience the world is your knowledge of the world, right? So it is a reaction against modernism and its ideal utopian belief in progress. But there are a few others who say that there is no such thing called as postmodernism. In fact, postmodernism is a continuation of modernism, right? In fact, some philosophers like Heidegger go on to say that there is no modernism without postmodernism. Because in order to understand the modern subject, you need to step out of that modern subject. And that is why postmodernism actually comes before modernism, right? But I don't want you to get so complicated in your heads about this. But please understand that there are two approaches to postmodernism. One is postmodernism is a reaction against modernism. And the second one is postmodernism is the continuation, right, of modernism. It is a different approach to modernism, but it has its roots in modernism. Are you all with me right now? Are you all following?
Yes, ma'am.
Right. Okay, don't worry about these concepts. It's okay if you haven't really understood, because that is the whole point of this presentation, that I will be doing this through gender and through literature so that you will be able to relate to what I'm saying. So I'm going to give you examples where this ideal utopian progressive world, or this ideal notion of, say, an identity or a world or a language or a discipline is questioned through literature. Okay, right. So the term postmodern, of course, it was loosely used by many writers before Lyotard. But then Lyotard is given this credit that he was the first person to use the term postmodern in a very philosophical, intellectual sense, right? In his very famous book, The Postmodern Condition, which was published in 1979. Okay. So, and how does he define postmodernism? He says, I define postmodern as incredulity towards meta-narratives. You see, that is his basic definition of postmodernism. So do not believe that somebody tells you that, when somebody tells you this is your history, this is the history of India. What is the history that we all studied? This was the history of emperors, of empires, of battles, of treaties, of consolidations, of how the British colonized us, for instance. So what did you read as history? You mostly read political history. You read history of people who either were conquered or expanded their territories to a large extent, right? So you are given to believe that history is about political expansion. History is about the growth and rise and fall of empires. That history is made of great people, warriors, conquerors, right, who created great empires, right? So you have a Vikramaditya, you have the Chola Empire, you have Rajaraja Chola, I think first, second, third, fourth, name it, right? And you have been given to believe that, there were people who conquered the whole world, like Alexander the Great, right? So the idea that the political aspect of existence is the most historical aspect that comes to you from a colonial understanding of history, right? But if you go back to your village and ask some of the people there, senior people, elderly people, grandmothers, grandfathers, right? Ask them about the story of the village, right? So you will see that they have their own local histories. They have their folk tales, they have their traditions, they have their festivals, they have their performative oral, acts of being. And for most of us, history is a thing that we experience through our local cultures. History is a thing that is not political, right? History is a thing that is very deeply cultural. So when is it that we dissociated culture from history? When is it that society and culture was one last component of your history chapter, right? I think there is some disturbance. Yeah. So remember your history textbooks? I mean, the last part would be architecture, right? Society and culture. Those were the most interesting parts for me, at least, right? And I was really, really terrible at, if you ask me today, when was this treaty signed? Or if you ask me who constructed this temple, right? I will not know, because these are factual, aspects of history. But what is actually history? History is basically the negotiation with experience and time and space, right? And histories can only be understood in terms of collectives, right? So people, races, ethnicities, tribes, localities, urban, rural, okay, caste. Especially in India, there is no history without caste, right? Because each set of people or group of people has a different experience of time or of space, of what they experience as history, right? So history is something that is very contemporary. History is not a thing of the past, right? You have been given to believe that history is a thing of the past because you have always looked at history as actions, events that happened in the past, right? So the first thing that I want you to look at is this definition of the postmodern given by Lyotard, who says, I define postmodern as incredulity, right? Don't credulously believe all the meta narratives. So science tells you that this is this and this is that, right? But science is one way of looking at things. Science is also a narrative, History is also a narrative. Are you all with me? Are you able to follow what I'm talking about? Right. Let me give you a very simple example. So when was it that you first understood heat? What is your understanding of heat? Where does it come from? How do you know how something is hot or not? Did you learn what hot is from your physics textbook, where you had a chapter on heat?
By feeling it, by experiencing.
Yeah, exactly. So somebody told you when you were a little child not to touch a hot object, right? Or somebody told you you have to wait for the milk or the coffee or whatever or food to cool down, right? And what did you do? You went and touched it anyway. And then you understood, okay, this is hot, this is heat, right? So for example, sitting in Bangalore, I might not find Bangalore weather very, very cold. I might find it very pleasant right now because it has rained all night and all evening yesterday. It's extremely cool, pleasant, typical Bangalore weather. For anybody who comes from Tamil Nadu, for example, some of my colleagues, they find it extremely cold, right? They find Bangalore very cold and very difficult to live in sometimes, right? They hate the rains. They are longing for the sun, right? Whereas Bangalore people are so used to, this kind of, now it is almost sometimes it looks like a mountain resort, actually, like you've gone to a hill station or something. And in my dad's time, in my dad and mom's time, right, it was called mini Ooty, right? Because Bangalore is on a plateau. It is slightly above the sea level, much, much above the sea level than other parts of Karnataka. Say, for example, Mysore. Mysore always has 2 degrees hotter climate, right, than us, or there is a 2-degree difference, and that is a lot of difference. I find Mysore very hot. When I come to Shivakashi, I might find it extremely hot. Recently, I had gone to Trichy, which is supposed to be the hottest, one of the hottest places in Tamil Nadu. I hope I'm right. I'm getting my facts right. And I found it extremely hot, right? But not so hot that it was unbearable. But I mean, I would say Bangalore is very pleasant. But for somebody coming from Tamil Nadu, Bangalore might be extremely cold, right? So you have your own experience of what is hot, what is cold. Science is one way of understanding what is hot. So science will tell you that milk boils at this temperature, water boils at this temperature, right? And that is how heat is described to you. So if you talk to your mother or your father or somebody who handles vessels in the kitchen, or who has been cooking in your kitchen for a really long time, their understanding of heat will be very different. So you might not be able to pick up a vessel because it's very hot, but your mother may be able to pick it, or maybe your father may be able to pick it up because they are so used to hot objects in the kitchen or standing in front of the fire, right? So this is the same thing with body temperature. When you go to a doctor, right, sometimes you have temperature, but the thermometer will not show the temperature, right? So the doctor says, no, you don't have any fever, right? But you're trying to tell the doctor, look here, I'm feverish. There is something called as feverishness, which is very, very personal and subjective. And there is something called fever, which is very scientific. And if there is no thermometer which can measure or check how much fever you have, it will not be accepted or acknowledged by medical science as fever, right? So what we think of science as something that is absolute, which is truthful, which is correct, which is 100% precise, is also a narrative, right? And that is what postmodernism is trying to do. It is trying to be incredulous, right, of whatever is meta, whatever is absolute, or whatever is given to you as the whole truth, the absolute truth. Okay, so like I said, you can go back to Immanuel Kant, Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, Heidegger, Martin Heidegger, and Jacques Lacan. All of them, right, in their own ways, I think paved the path or paved the way for what we today call as postmodernism, right? So let me come to that a little later. Have you been following what I've been talking about till now?
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So how does the meta break down, right? How do we break down the meta as a postmodern subject or in a postmodern condition, right? How does postmodernism encounter the meta or the meta narratives which claim absolute truth and knowledge over human experience, or homogenize human experience, which means that all of us experience things in the same way, which we do not, right? So the first thing is it questions the assumed integrity and objectivity of knowledge systems and ideals such as love and truth, right? So where does our idea of love come from? It comes from Valentine's Day, it comes from Milton Boone romances, it comes from Bollywood cinema, right? So I think very shortly, I just got this post yesterday from one of my friends, right? So we are going to celebrate 1,000 weeks of Dilwale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge, right? And it's supposed to be the longest running film in in Indian cinemas, in in Bollywood, especially Bollywood cinema, right? So you have this idea of, okay, this is romance, this is love, right? And you look at it in terms of absolute love, right? This is love. Like Shakespeare tells you, right? Love is not love if it bends with the remover, right? Or it changes, right? According to him, love is something that remains unchanged, unchanging, right? And that is a very Renaissance utopian ideal of love, right? We know that when you are in a relationship, the dynamics change, the relationship itself changes, people in the relationship change, and love is something that you need to keep working on. It's not like you love a person and you will always love that person. You have, in order to keep loving that person, you need to acknowledge the fact that the relationship is changing, the people are changing, circumstances and conditions are changing. So it's a work in progress, right? So what this means is nothing is straightforward, nothing is unified, right? Everything is discursive. So the operative term in postmodernism is the term discursive. What does that mean? Discursive has two meanings. Discursive is anything that is not straight, right? Anything that cannot be traced back to its origin is discursive. And the second meaning of discursive is anything that belongs to a discourse is discursive, right? So what does that mean? It means that we all have a set of ideas. And what happens over a period of time, certain ideas become naturalized and normalized, and they become a discourse. So for example, love is a discourse. Science is a discourse. History is a discourse. Religion is a discourse. Basically, it means that there are a set of ideas which are prescribed to you as an absolute system of knowledge. And that is what we mean by, ideas being narrativized, right? So, but we realize that what you consider to be the discourse is actually discursive, which means that it is ideological and ideas change. Ideas can be manipulated. Ideas can be translated, interpreted, right? So when there is a majority community, right, which interprets ideas as, okay, these are perfect, and this is how you need to look at something, you believe that this is the whole absolute truth, right? And that is how, we are conditioned by the discursive, right, understanding of knowledge systems, right? Knowledge as something that is crystallized and absolute and whole, right? But we know, based on the examples that we just now discussed, that knowledge is experiential. Knowledge is not something that you completely get out of a book. Knowledge is something that you acquire because we all experience realities differently. So there is something called as lived experience. And that is what we mean when we say ontology. Ontology is basically a system of knowledge that has to do with experience. It is subjective. Whereas epistemology is a system of thought. For example, science with a capital H, S, history with a capital H. All of these are epistemologies. What are epistemologies? These are systems of knowledge, right? So postmodernism looks at the ontological, the experiential. It looks at lived experience, right? It does not look at the epistemological. Yes, the epistemological is also one aspect of knowledge, but then that is a system of knowledge and it is not absolute, right? And how we understand the epistemological depends on how we live our lives or how we interact with the world in our own subjective terms. So all narratives are discursively formed, including epistemological systems such as science and history. So there is somebody who is narrating history to you. There is somebody who is narrating science to you. There is a language to science. So how many of you are familiar with the taxes, income tax, professional tax, and these things? I mean, I'm not familiar. I pay my taxes, but I need a CA to interpret taxes to me, right? How many of you are familiar with the laws? How many of you are able to deal with a legal document if it is given to you? Most of us are not. Why? Because the language is so complex. The language is so, difficult to understand. You need a lawyer, you need an advocate to prepare a legal document for you or to help you to understand. Somebody serves a notice to you, will you be able to understand? No. Or if you buy a property, will you be able to prepare a registration document to register your property? No, you need a lawyer. I paid about 25K to a lawyer when I bought my first house, just to prepare the document. Can you believe it? Right? And I thought, oh my God, what is this? because I don't have the language. Similarly, when you go to doctors and when they tell you something, what has happened to your body, it simply means that you are so distanced from your body that you don't know what is happening to it, right? So that is the reason why we don't understand medical terms, right? And it needs to be simplified to us. So you see that there are various epistemological knowledge systems which are controlling your relationship with the world, because they possess the language of that knowledge system, and you don't have that. And that is why you need teachers, you need CAs, you need doctors, you need lawyers, you need policemen to tell you what is just or unjust, or whether punishment can follow crime or not, right? So every knowledge system has its own language, and that language is controlled, manipulated, and narrativized by people who speak that language, right? And you are given to believe that, yes, if you are, say, for example, a student of literature, you cannot be scientific. That is so totally wrong. That is so totally wrong. You don't have to be a graduate in science to be scientific. All of us have the scientific temperament. All of us have reasonable, rational ways of approaching the world. Science is just one system of knowledge. You are not part of that system. It doesn't mean that you're not scientific, right? So this is what postmodernism is about. It breaks down all these meta narratives and structures which tell you that, right, look here, you need to be a student of science to understand how a machine works. You need to be a student of biology to understand how a body works, right? Look at our ancestors. They had such a good understanding of the body. So today we are talking about organic food, right? And we pay 3 times the price of local food, which is full of pesticides and insecticides, to be able to eat something organic today. Why? Because today somebody has to tell you, look here, you need to eat organic food because it is locally grown, locally produced. It doesn't have pesticides and insecticides. But you had this knowledge already 2 generations back. My grandfather and my grandmother never ate anything that came out of a machine, never ate any processed and packaged food. They ate fruits that were seasonal. They ate, food that was prepared at home, fresh, hot, well cooked, nutritious, well balanced. And nobody really sat down with a textbook to look at how much protein is there, how much carbohydrate is there, how much fat is there, right? And it took us about 20 years to realize that ghee is actually good for our body. We know that today because Western science, right, had told you that ghee is bad, right? Ghee is fattening. Today we know that ghee is good. And I remember my grandmother always used to say, you should have ghee with every hot meal that you eat because it helps with your digestion, right? It helps in the smooth flow of food in the intestinal tract, and also the whole process later, right? The food has to move from your stomach into your intestines, right? So the ghee is the idea of eating ghee is very scientific. And today, people are telling you, go back to cow ghee, go back to organic ghee, and you end up paying 3 times more that amount. Look at what your knowledge systems have done to you, to your body, to your understanding of the world, right? This is just an example. Are you all with me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So let us look at this now. Knowledge is subjective, contingent, meaning to say right now, I'm sitting here at my home in Bangalore. I'm not in college, obviously, because NAC visit is happening and it's impossible to do anything in the department there. So right now, right, I'm in this space, in this time. Right now, I'm speaking because of the experiences that I have had with this world, right? And my experience or knowledge of the world is contingent, which means that there is an immediacy, right? I'm experiencing what I'm experiencing because I'm sitting here. You are experiencing what you're experiencing because you're in Shivakashi, most of you, right? So it is experiential, contingent, subjective, therefore ontological. I hope you understood the term ontological. This is very important for postmodern approaches, okay? So look at this quotation. Shift in the emphasis of knowledge from the ends of human action to its means. The loss of a continuous meta-narrative therefore breaks down the subject into heterogeneous moments of subjectivity that do not cohere into an identity. So if somebody tells me Sushma is this, Sushma should be like this, right? That is not true because Sushma has changes every day. If you meet me after 3 years, I'll be very different. I'm very different from the last time I came to Kalishwari College. For example, I was not wearing these glasses then, right? I was a very different person before COVID, right? Now we are all very different people. 3 years later, I'm, talking to you. And maybe 3 years back, I would not have been able to use my laptop so well. But today I'm able to, because my realities have changed with online teaching, online learning, with lockdowns and being at home. My relationships with people have changed, right? So if you're going to tell me you have to be Sushma in this way, that way, and that this is your identity, nothing can be, far from the truth. Nothing can be more distant from the truth than that, right? Because we are all in these heterogeneous is varied, different moments of subjectivity, right? And what are we looking at? We are looking at what is knowledge. Knowledge is not some end that you have to reach. Knowledge is basically how you are what you are, which means that we are looking at the means and not the end, right? And when you are looking at the means, you're looking at the process. So the process becomes more important than the product, right? So instead of saying I am Sushma, right, it's important for me to articulate what that Sushma is based on who I am right now. Who is Sushma, right? I'm a woman. I mean, I identify as a woman. I'm a Hindu, right? Because I was born into a Hindu family. I belong to a certain caste. I belong to a certain community. I live in Bangalore, so I have an urban identity. So all of these are part of the contingency of my identity. So my identity is contingent, it's immediate, right? So tomorrow, probably if I go abroad or I live in another part of India, my identity will change accordingly, right? So that is the whole idea of a postmodern reality. A postmodern reality is not fixed, it's not absolute, right? And there are no postmodern identities. There are only heterogeneous moments of subjectivity. Of course, there are processes of identity. Identities are not always already there. Identities are not fixed, right? And that is a quotation by Gary Aylesworth, right? Now, why are we looking at transdisciplinarity? And why did I decide to talk about transdisciplinarity and gender, right, for your conference? So post-disciplinary approaches to knowledge, experience, being, right? Foreground, what we call as postmodern. Post-disciplinary means that you don't have to look at things from a disciplinary point of view. So history department will tell you, this is how you need to look at history. Literature department will tell you, no, this is not how you need to look at history. History is human experience. So you can read partition literature and understand what happened during partition, as much as you can understand the event of partition from a history textbook. And if you ask me personally, I would rather read a partition narrative than a partition history from a history textbook, right? Because a partition narrative will give me other aspects of how something was experienced that was violent. For example, memory, emotion, human relationships. What happened to communities who lived on the border? What happened to people who were traveling by train, right, to the other side of the border, trying to be either Hindu or Muslim based on their geographical identity, which was newly imposed on them. There is this beautiful story. I don't know if you have read it. I can't remember the author suddenly. I'll maybe share it with you later. So there is a couple who are crossing the border, right? They are traveling from India to, I think from Pakistan to India. And they are actually crossing the river Ravi, right? You know that Ravi is one of the rivers in Punjab. Punjab itself means 5 rivers, right? So they are traveling with 2 babies, newly born babies, right? Very, very young babies, right? Babies are young, obviously, but then these are really very, very small babies. They're maybe a few days after they are born, right? And the husband and the wife are carrying these babies. They are twins. Okay. What happens, I mean, I'm sure you have either watched or read A Train to Pakistan and other works which have looked at this transition or this politics of dislocation. So one of the baby dies. It dies on the train. And what they decide is, instead of taking the baby across, because it's going to take many days for us to go across the border, we are going to give it a watery grave. So they decide that when the train is going over the river Ravi, they will throw the body of the child into the water and give it a, they will let the body go and the baby go and let it to rest. So they will give it a watery grave is what they think. So when they are crossing upon the bridge, the Ravi is flowing underneath the bridge. The husband, the man, takes the baby and throws it into the water. Right? And then he comes back. After some time, the couple realize that they have actually thrown the baby that was alive, and the baby that is with them is dead, right? This is a story from a partition narrative, right? No history textbook will give you this kind of a story, right? And this is a, I mean, it's a very painful, I mean, it's a very shocking, very brutal, graphic story about what really happened. You see, there are two identities. There are twins here, right? And they're very symbolic because one is India and the other is Pakistan, right? So you have to kill your Indianness because you are a Muslim and become a Pakistani. And if you're living in Pakistan, you have to come back across the border and become Indian in order to be Hindu, right? So this is what happens. You have to kill the other, or the other is dead, right? And there was a time when you were a Hindu and a Muslim without being an Indian or a Pakistani, right? So today we are asking the same question in India, right? Who is an Indian? Who is an Indian? And what is the meaning of the term Hindu? What is the meaning of the term Muslim today in India? I will not go into politics because it's extremely controversial, and I really don't want to talk about those things. Are only examples, right? But I want you to think about this. So if somebody tells you you are not Indian because you are Hindu or Muslim or Christian or Sikh or something else, how will you feel? When you have grown up in a world where from your school onwards, you have been singing your national anthem, you have respect for the national flag, you have identified yourself as Indian, not because of your religion, but because of certain other histories that you have studied or you have been part of. What if somebody tells you you are more Indian and less Tamil? How will you feel about it? I think people in Tamil Nadu would like to identify themselves as, okay, we are Tamil, we are Tamilians. Same thing with Karnataka, right? We are Kannadigas, right? Nothing wrong with that. You don't have to be ashamed of being Tamil in order to be an Indian. But if you live in a government which is hegemonic, under a government or a system that is hegemonic, it will ask you to choose one identity above another identity, or it will validate one identity against another identity, right? So when you look at identities or experiences through disciplinary boundaries, this is what happens, right? So knowledge is subjective, it is experiential, it is contingent, it has to do with your being, and therefore knowledge has to be free from systematic organization, because knowledge obviously to a postmodernist is based on experience, right? And your experience is very subjective. It does not come under disciplinary boundaries. So the idea that today we talk about cultural studies, for instance, is because of this post-disciplinary approach to knowledge systems. So cultural studies is basically post-disciplinary, which means that in a cultural studies course, you will be doing anthropology, sociology, literature, art, aesthetics, music, performing arts, everything you'll be doing at history. You will be looking at everything under culture, right? You will not say, okay, I'm not going to look at history because I'm not from the history department. I'm not going to look at society because I'm not from the sociology department. So today we belong to systems that are post-disciplinary, right? And what is the approach to post-disciplinary? How do you go out of your disciplinary boundaries? You do that through transdisciplinarity. And what is transdisciplinarity? Acknowledging the fact that my idea of the world comes from these different so-called disciplines, right? And my understanding of something is not regulated by the discipline that I choose to practice, but rather from human experience itself, which is transdisciplinary. It crosses all boundaries. It goes beyond boundaries, right? So transdisciplinarity originates from and leads to subversion of the meta. So how do you question the meta narratives in a postmodern sense? To begin with, transdisciplinarity comes from this questioning of the meta, and it is sustained by the questioning of the meta, which means that you have to keep questioning the meta narratives, right, in order to be transdisciplinary. Otherwise, you cannot be transdisciplinary. If you believe that, okay, psychology has these boundaries, and I'm not going to look at the human mind because it is belongs to the domain or discipline of psychology, then you cannot do any psychoanalytical reading. You can't read Freud, you can't read Lacan. You can't do a psychoanalytical reading of the yellow wallpaper. So a lot of things that we are doing in the English department right now, as students, as teachers, you don't even have to be part of a university, even readers, right? We all already have this transdisciplinary approach, right? And you could say that literature is the most transdisciplinary of all, I think, approaches. Why? Because literature has always not had any boundaries. Literature is one space where you can look at human experience without boundaries. We have not had these boundaries. Literature is sociology, literature is history, literature is psychology, literature is anthropology, literature is cultural studies. We have done this for ages now without talking about it, right? So one of the most postmodern of narratives, one of the most transdisciplinary of narratives is literature, right? So let's look at the question of gender now. I hope you got a good introduction to postmodernism, and I hope you have been able to understand what we say when we say postmodern, right?
Yes,
Are you all with me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you so much, right? So if your identity, if your being, if your experience is not fixed, then how can you say that your sex or your gender is fixed or natural, right? So what does this mean? That your sex is biologically determined, that your sex is not biological. You are not born into a sex. You were identified as belonging to a certain sex because of certain sexual characteristics, right? And you have heard of hermaphrodites, right? Who are hermaphrodites? People who have both male and female genitalia when they are born, right? So what normally happens in a hermaphrodite child is the parents and the doctor get together and they decide which part of the genitalia should be kept. And the sex of the child is decided right at the time of birth, which means that what we believe to be male or female is a process of identification, which means that just as much as gender is socially constructed, even sex is biologically determined, right? I know that this is a little difficult for you to understand, right? So it's like saying, for example, you look at my hand here, right? If I were to ask you, what is the gender of this hand? Okay, let me remove my bangle, right? Would you say this is my forearm or hand, or how would you respond to this? Would you call this male or female? No. If I go to the doctor and I say, look here, my arm is aching, my forearm or my upper arm is aching, right? I will call it an arm. I will not call it the female arm or a male arm. But there are certain parts of your body which are taken into consideration to decide whether you're male or female. So what does the doctor do? The first thing the doctor does is to look at one aspect of the body, which is the genitalia. So if there is a phallus there, right? There is a male organ there, the body is identified as male. If there is no phallus, it is identified as female, right? And because in majority of the bodies, we see male and female genitalia, we identify the sexes as either male or female, right? But this is not the norm. So if you actually look at somebody like Anne Foster Sterling, who is a feminist biologist, right? According to her, there are at least 5 sexes, right? And male, she has this beautiful essay, the 5 sexes, why male and female are not enough. So what I'm trying to tell you here is that today in postmodern approaches to gender, we don't just question gender, we also question sex. So what second wave feminism did was it questioned gender and it looked at gender as socially constructed, but it assumed that sex is biological, right? But sex and gender cannot be separated. You cannot say this is my sex and this is my gender, because you are identified with a particular gender because of a certain body which is identified biologically as male or female. So you cannot separate sex and gender, right? So which means that your sexuality arising from your body is also historical. It is contingent, right? Do you know that before the 17th century, in most of the ancient European languages, there were no separate terms for male and female genitalia. The same term was used for both male and female genitalia, which means that the body was not identified on the basis of sexual difference, right? It was not defined on the basis of genitalia. It was defined on the basis of something else, right? So today we live in a society where your gender is identified on the basis of your natural sex, right? But what I'm trying to tell you here is that you only have matter and materiality. You have a body. Your body in itself, by itself, is not male or female. It is identified because of certain biological characteristics as male or female. Okay, I'm so sorry, I have made a mistake here. It should be Judith Butler, right? So what is gender? Gender is a kind of imitation for which there is no original, she says, which means that you are a woman or you are a man because you perform your gender, right? So I'm dressing up like a woman. I talk like a woman. I walk like a woman. So I like a little bit of color. I like a little bit of jewelry. I like a certain way of clothing, of walking, of talking. So you know, that is how I become a woman. I'm not naturally a woman or a man, right? So this is a very important postmodern questioning of the meta narrative of both culture and biology. Neither culture nor biology are absolute. And what we define as gender is based on how we perform our genders. Are you all with me at this point of time?
Yes, ma'am.
Can I go on?
Yes, ma'am.
Right. So this is what I meant, right? Today I thought I'll look at a few, now that I have covered the theoretical aspects, I hope I have been able to give you some insight. So to begin with, postmodernism recognizes that neither gender nor sex are absolute or fixed. Gender and sex are narrativized. Gender is narrativized largely by society. Sex is largely narrativized by science, that too biological sciences. Okay. And what you are in terms of your sex and gender is something subjective. It is something contingent, right? And something even like your sexuality is historical, which means that you perform your sexuality based on the time and space in which you are born and you are living, right? Yeah. So I want you to look at a few texts, so I would recommend this to all of you. Please do not say this is a postmodern text. That would be wrong. It's better to say, because there is no one way of defining what is a postmodern text. You can only say I'm doing a postmodern reading of a text. Please use the term postmodern approaches or postmodern reading. Okay, don't say postmodern like that, because there is no one way of being postmodern, right? So I told you that the term postmodern defies all definitions. So it's better to qualify it as a postmodern reading, especially if you are doing this for literature. So let me look at a text which writes back to the empire, White Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys. Have you all read Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte? Yeah, I think some of you would have, literature students would have, research scholars would have. So you've heard the story of Jane and how she goes to Mr. Rochester's Thornfield Hall as a governess for a young child called Adele, and how she falls in love with Mr. Rochester, and they're almost at the altar about to get married when she realizes that Mr. Rochester is already married. And there are these sounds at night, there are these shadows at night, and there are these movements and hysterical laughter at night, right? Which she's not able to understand where it's coming from, right? Where they are coming from. And later she realizes that Mr. Rochester is already married to a woman called Bertha Mason from the Caribbean. So she's a Creole, right? And she is locked up in the attic because she is a mad woman, right? And you're looking at, at a point of time in history where men were not allowed to obtain divorce, if the spouse, men or women for that matter. So insanity could not be used as grounds for divorce. So Mr. Rochester was technically married to this Creole woman, right? But then, he could not lead a normal life with her, right? And he chose to keep it a secret, and he locked her up in the attic, right? So this is one of the great Victorian novels of all time, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. So Jean Rhys, who is a Dominican writer from the Caribbean, she looked at the Creole representation in Victorian literature, especially British literature, and she saw that a lot of Creole women were represented as insane or mad or lacking moral standards. So you see, the post-colonial writer in her really wanted to respond to this. So she wrote a modern adaptation of Jane Eyre from the point of view of the mad woman in the attic who did not have any voice in Jane Eyre. And she called this White Sargasso Sea, right? And this is a very good example for a postmodern work. To begin with, you have a story which questions the larger meta-narrative of colonial history, right? Of the history of colonialism. Because you have a voice from the colonies, you have a Creole voice from the colonies, from the Caribbean, who is telling the story. And it's not the English author who is telling the story of the Creole anymore, right? And there are no perpetrator-victim positions here. Normally, we like to think that the colonized is the victim and the colonizer is the perpetrator. No. The colonizer was as much appropriated by colonialism, right, as the colonized were. That is why if you look at this novel, you have a narrative structure where the novel is divided into three parts, right? The first part is the story of Antoinette, right? Who is Bertha Mason in the original Jane Eyre, right? The second part is the story of Mr. Rochester when he comes to the Caribbean to marry Antoinette and take her back home to Thornfield Hall. And the third part of the story is narrated by a Jamaican, woman, right? A local woman, right? So you have a novel which looks at the whole history of colonialism in, the Caribbean, especially in Jamaica, through the three very distinct voices of, you have a Creole, right? You have a white man, Mr. Rochester, and you have the local woman, right, who is Jamaican. So you see, it's very interesting to see how when Mr. Rochester comes to the, Caribbean islands, he finds it extremely difficult to understand this landscape, to understand the people there. And he's the subject of the gaze of the colonized. They hate him. They hate the white men because they colonized them, right? Obviously, how will the people who were once slaves look at a man who colonized them, right? So you look at how the white man is also under the rubric of colonialism, and he is equally appropriated by colonial ideology, right? And that is not a very comfortable place to be in. So which means that if you're doing a postmodern reading, you cannot assume these binaries. You cannot always say the white man is powerful and the colonized are less powerful or, oppressed. Of course, they were oppressed. But you also need to look at the whole politics of power and how the colonizer was appropriated within this discourse of colonialism, which gave him this false sense of power, right? So look at the, different identities or aspects of what forms an identity when you look at a postmodern reading, instead of assuming these binary positions, okay? So the next two examples that I want to give are also historically grounded. One is Arasanayagam. Arasanayagam is a Sri Lankan poet. She is a Dutch burgher, right? Which means that her great-great-grandfather was one of the first Dutchmen to land on the shores of, what we today call as Sri Lanka, right? So what was then called as Ceylon, right? And she is half Sinhalese, half Dutch. She's married to a Tamil, right? And she writes poetry during this period, right? She's writing at a point of time when Sri Lanka had the civil war and you had the conflict, the ethnic conflict, the inter-ethnic conflict between the Sinhalese and the Tamils. So imagine a woman who has Dutch ancestry, Dutch roots, who is half Sinhalese, and then who is married to a Tamil, right? What is her hybrid identity in Sri Lanka, right? What is the history of Sri Lanka that she relates? And how is that different from, say, a Sinhalese history or a Tamil history, right? Or a colonial history of Sri Lanka. So it's important to read these works because they give you that understanding of what it means to break down a meta-narrative of history, right? So native ethnic hybrid identities, right? So look at Half of a Yellow Sun. It is the story of the Biafran War or the civil war in Nigeria from the point of view of, an Igbo, right? So what happened to Africa when it was appropriated and cut into different, countries based on a totally inappropriate logic? Because before you became African, you were once an Igbo or some other tribe, right? So that is what Adichie says. She says, for me, the Igbo identity is far superior to the Nigerian identity or the African identity because I will always be an Igbo. And what does it mean to write a post-colonial history of Africa from the point of view of being an Igbo, right? This is a postmodern work. This also has a narrative structure where you have a character called Richard, right? And Richard comes from the US. He is a white character and he is narrating the middle half of the story, right? So what does he think of what is happening in Nigeria? Is he with the US, which sends arms and ammunition to the Nigerian military forces to defeat the Igbos, right? What does he do as a reporter, as a journalist? What history of the war, of the Biafran war, does he, tell the world, right? As a journalist, what is his responsibility here? So you see all of these, works that I'm talking about are postmodern works because they do not assume that they are telling the story of a meta history or a meta narrative, right? And what is the role of gender here, right? You are not just a woman, you are an Igbo. You are not just a Nigerian, you are a woman, right? And what did the women go through during the Nigerian war? What did women go through during the Sri Lankan war, where blood was literally flowing upon the streets, right? So these are basically women's histories. And the very fact that history is his story, that there is no room for women to tell their stories. Now, look at all your warriors, look at all your empire builders, your great kings and monarchs in history, all of them are men, right? Of course, you might look at a Jhansi Ki Rani or a, you might look at one or two people here and there and say, okay, these women also ruled over their kingdoms, or, they were great people, right? But history is largely an account of men's events and activities, how they built empires. Wars are narratives of men, violent men, institutionalized violence, right? So these are some of the works that you need to look at, right? How the politics of gender, of being a woman, for example, or being a man, for example, defines your relationship with your history. And how do you narrate a history which is not male? How do you narrate a history which is not colonial? How do you narrate a history which is ethnic and not racial or racist? How do you narrate a history which looks at the heterogeneity of hybrid identities, where you're neither Tamil nor Sinhalese nor Dutch, right? And as a woman, you're looking at the violence meted out by men on the streets, okay? Right. Are you all following? Can we go to the next slide?
Yes, ma'am.
So this is something that you all will be able to relate to. I know it's a very beautiful picture, right? But I am not looking at something so beautiful, right? So I'm looking at a very beautiful short story, beautiful in a postmodern sense, right? I'm sure you have read Breast Stories by Mahashweta Devi, right? Of course, we read Dopdi. Dopdi is prescribed in all syllabuses, and a lot of people do research or doing research on Mahashweta Devi look at Dopdi. But I would like you to look at The Breast Giver, right? Which is the second story in the collection called Breast Stories, right? Now, Mahashweta Devi, quite like Arasanayagam, quite like Adichie, was one of those women who questioned the formation of the Indian nation, of the national identity which was imposed upon the tribes, right? And she looks at the changes that happen in post-colonial India, right? Or nationalist India. What happens to the dynamics of caste? What happens to the dynamics of gender, right? So Jashoda or Yashoda. Jashoda is the Bengali name for Yashoda, right? So Jashoda is the protagonist of the story, and she is married to Kangali Charan. And look at the name, Kangali Charan, right? So he is a priest in the temple. Obviously, we are looking at a Brahmin couple and who have many children, very poor, a poor Brahmin family. So what happens, you see, one day as he's crossing the street, Kangali Charan's feet are severed when a bike, right, passes upon it, right? So the youngest member of the Haldar family. So who are the Haldars? They are the zamindars of the village, right? Very rich, right? So the youngest son of the family runs his bike over his feet, and Kangali Charan loses his feet, right? So Charan means feet, right? And Kangal means poor, right? So Mahashweta Devi uses a name which very, very aptly represents the inversion of caste because of the incursions of modernity in India, right? So you actually see that although you're looking at Jashoda, who is a Brahmin, right? She is poor and therefore she is inferior to the Haldars. So what is going to happen to the children? Because now Kangali Charan cannot earn money anymore, right? He cannot work in the temple, right? So what they do is the Haldar family allows Jashoda to breastfeed the children of the Haldar family because she is an upper caste woman. She is allowed to breastfeed. She becomes a wet nurse, which means that if she has to keep feeding the Haldar family, the children of the Haldar family, the babies of the Haldar family, she has to keep producing children, right? So this is a very Marxist critique of the social construction of motherhood, because quite like Yashoda, Jashoda is a foster mother. She is not the biological mother of the children who are born into the Haldar family, but she breastfeeds them, right? Quite like Jashoda, who took care of Krishna until he went back to Mathura, right? To wage his wars and to uphold Dharma, right? During the Kurukshetra war, it was Jashoda who took care of Krishna, but she never gave birth to Krishna, right? Similarly, Jashoda in this story takes care of the Haldar family. And at the end of the story, You see her lying, literally, a corpse, right, with wounds festering all over her breast because she has developed breast cancer, right? And not a single child. I mean, all this Haldar family children have grown up. All her sons and children have grown up, which are many of them, because she has to keep feeding the babies. And, she's pregnant every 9 months so that she can keep being a wet nurse for the Haldar family. So this is basically how, Mahashweta Devi looks at the whole post-colonial condition of modernity, right? Where caste does not necessarily mean that you have a superior position, where class perhaps is the demarcation of social superiority, right? And what is the social construction of motherhood? You may not be a biological mother, but if you are born a woman, socially you will always be, constructed as a mother. That is why we use the term amma, right? Because, for example, everybody, you say chikama, dodamma, we say, right? Or we, use amma with names in Kannada, right? What does that mean? It means that there is a notion of women being motherly, whether they are mothers or not biologically, right? And Jashoda upholds that system of late capitalism where exchange value has more than use value, right? So, for example, the idea of labor, right? And how when a woman is in the pain of the throes of labor, when she gives birth to a child, the child is not hers. It becomes the father's, it becomes the community's, the religion, the village, the gotra, the nakshatra, or, whatever. What is the name given to the child? The child is given the name of the father or the place of the father. And the genealogy of the child is traced through the father. And the woman who has produced the commodity or the product the child does not own. Quite like Marx said, the proletariat does not own the means of production. It is the capitalists, right? So this is a very beautiful postmodern text which questions this meta-narrative construction of caste, construction of subalternity, construction of the meta-narrative of marriage, motherhood, right? And the social construction of gender through femininity and motherhood. Okay, right. So this is a queer text which I want you to look at. Again, Sri Lankan. I always bring this to my presentations because it's very relatable. So this is a story about RG, a young boy who realizes that he is gay, right? That he, at a very young age, he realizes that he wants to play with girls. He has feminine, so-called feminine attributes, right? And this is also situated at the time when the Sri Lankan civil war is happening, right? And because he is Sinhalese, right? The ancestral home is burned down and the family is forced to migrate to Canada, right? So this is a text about queer diaspora, right? So what does it mean for you to be queer? It means that you don't belong to your assigned gender or sex or sexuality. And what does it mean for you to question the absoluteness of sex, gender, and sexuality, right? Yeah, I think I will go a little fast because I may not have too much of time. This is again, a very important concern that I want you to look at, right? And this is an illustration. I mean, this is artwork by Kalki Subramaniam, who is one of my favorite all-time transgender writers in India, right? I'm sure you all have heard of Kalki Subramaniam. I had the good fortune of meeting her at a conference many years back, right? So she's a transgender activist, writer, artist, right, who has done immense work for transgender communities, especially in Tamil Nadu, right? So I have taken this illustration from her, but the idea that the trans identity, the transgender identity, right, it breaks down all barriers of gender and sex, because to be transgender, you need to either have a transformation in terms of the body, which means that you're questioning biology, because you know that most hijras in India, as they're popularly known as, male to female transgenders are called hijra, right? They undergo a sex transformation surgery, which is called as nirvana, right? And Kalki Subramaniam herself has a very beautiful text called Phallus I Cut. And I heard that it's more powerful in Tamil. Please go back and read it. I have the English translation, but then I don't really have much time for it. But I always take this as an example because this is a text where she questions caste, gender, religion, science, which is biology, and also the social constructions of femininity. She says, yes, I will not be able to be a mother. and I'm not a typical daughter to my mother, but still I'm a woman, right? And I have cut my phallus and I have become a woman, right? So phallus is the male organ, right? Which is considered to be the most definitive part of a male body, right? So when she transitions into a woman, when she becomes a woman, she undergoes nirvana, the surgery which allows her to perform the feminine gender, right? And the idea that gender does not follow from sex, that sex is something that is assigned to you, and that you can perform your gender, differently from the sex that is assigned to you. That is what the trans identity about. So this identity is about. So this is something that questions the trans identity or transgender texts. They question the meta narrative of biology, of culture, of society, of the institutions of marriage, motherhood, right? Of the institutions of kinship, society, caste, religion. All of these come into question through transgender texts. So if you have the time, there are a lot of beautiful Tamil trans writers, right? So please read them. And I hope that I have given you the queer angle as well. So when you look at gender, you need to look at the gender spectrum and the queer, right? Or what is otherwise identified popularly as the LGBTQAI, right? Identities have questioned the meta narratives. And whenever you read a trans or LGBT, piece of literature, you can do a postmodern reading very much, because the very basis of the transgender identity is a postmodern basis or foundation. Okay, right. So this is the last slide I have. This is something that all of us can relate to. Like I said, we are basically part of digital and virtual mediated technologies, cultures, and identities. So which means that you are not just using digital technology. You also live in a digital culture, right? Or what we call as the Internet of Things defines what we call today as networking societies, right? So we live in societies that are networked by technology, mediated by technology. Our social relationships, our sense of community, our sense of culture, all of these are defined by our virtual mediatized realities. Okay, so what we see as reality today is actually a simulacrum, right? What is a simulacrum? It is a copy or image without reference to an original, right? So you will see copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of what is assumed to be original. And that is what we mean by media. And that is why Donna Haraway says that we all live in a culture of affinities, right? We cannot anymore identify ourselves. Because you are a cyborg, you are not absolutely male or female or anything else. You're typically a cyborg. You're half animal, half machine, right? And half human. And you cannot deny it. So the mobile phone in my hand is not a device. It is an extension of who I am. There is no Sushma without a mobile phone today, right? It is an integral part of how I understand the world, how I constitute my being, how I interact, with a particular language, right? How I understand the whole politics of identifying with the world to a large extent is defined by my cyborg identity. And this is, I could say, the most postmodern approach to identities that we have had in a really, a long time now, right? So today we are looking at immersive technologies and cyborg, right, as the operative term, right, which is half human, half animal, half technological, right? And this is a very, very good illustration of the postmodern beings that we are, right? We are not absolute. We are not entire. We are not unified beings. We are mediated by different aspects of, the world. These could be the ecological, natural, organic aspects of nature and ecology. These could be the artificial, virtual, technological, man-made, machine-made realities, right, of a virtual world. Either way, right, what we are is, human, and we are human because of these, interactions. Okay, right. I hope you have understood this is the last slide, right? So how do you approach postmodern? This is a very beautiful postmodern work of art, right? It says, your gaze hits the side of my face, right? Which means that to a large extent, postmodern identities or postmodern subjectivities or whatever you choose to call it, right? These are informed by representation, because we live in a visual culture where representation plays a very important role, where the process becomes more important than the product. And there is no such thing called as a product. None of us are entire absolute products. in postmodernism, right? So beyond being to discursive text, all of us are texts. All of us are texts which are being narrativized, including your body. Your body is a text, your identity is a text, right? Your language is a text, the books that you read, right? The movies that you watch, all of them are part of who you are, right? And that is why I will conclude with Derrida, who says there is no outside text, right? There is nothing outside text. Everything is a text. It is mediated, it is logocentric, it is represented, it is negotiated, it is immersive, call it whatever you are, whatever you will. But all of us are basically part of the postmodern condition, which is not absolute, but rather, right, fragmented, contingent, organic, and in a process of becoming, right? Okay, thank you. Shall I stop the presentation?
Thank you, ma'am, for picturizing and sharing your valuable insights with a different perspective on gender with relatable examples. The forum is open for questions for the participants. You can share, put forward your views, thoughts, or queries. Virtual participants can drop it in the chat box or unmute to speak up.
I think there's something here in the chat box. Should I look at that first?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay. So there are some people who have just introduced themselves. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Archana. Thanks a lot. This is Suraj Soni. He says, I'm a PhD scholar. I'm working on postmodernism. I'm looking at it through time and space perspective. Okay. I wanted to know how to see shift or change in time and space. Okay. Okay. Okay, Suraj, I will put my email ID in the chat box. Okay. You need to look at certain theories of spatiality to understand the shifts in time and space. Okay. And a lot of it also depends on the kind of text that you're reading, because there is no absolute answer for this right now. Okay. So how do you identify the shift is what you're asking me. For that, I need to look at your, the nature of your primary text. Based on that, I can suggest readings for you, which will help you to locate these shifts. Okay. The second question, even if something is organically developed in remote time and space and it has nothing to do with Western modernity, it does not become postmodern. Postmodernism must have a political agenda to subvert, uncut, or dismantle. Okay. See, whether you are looking at postmodernity from a Western lens or not, right? The idea here is that everything is political. In postmodernism, everything is political, which means that postmodernism will always question things. It will not accept something as absolute. Okay. Nothing is developed remotely. In fact, how do you experience time and space? You experience time and space based on how you occupy time and space, based on your politics of location within that time and space. Right. So when we say time and space, we are not dissociated from it. Right? We are part of it. I hope I have answered your question. See, Western modernity need not be I gave you a background to postmodernism from a theoretical framework, because postmodernism is a Western, ideology basically, right? And approaches to postmodernism largely come from the West. But this is not to say that you should not take postmodern approaches to other texts, which I did right now, right? I hope I have answered your question. Can we, who is this who asked me the question? Suraj, I hope you have. Please get in touch with me, okay? Anjita says, can we place authors like Khalid Hosseini and others? Yeah. See, you can do a postmodern reading of any text, provided you can substantiate how the narrative questions a meta or an absolute truth, or how, it basically brings in a fragmentary, non-linear or non-absolute perspective to things, right? So any work of art or any piece of literature which questions this sense of the absolute can be treated as postmodern, okay? You can do a postmodern reading of even an ancient text, possible. You don't have to necessarily look at 21st century writings or late 20th century writings as postmodern, not necessarily. Like how you do an existential reading, Existentialism was a school of thought that emerged during the modernist period, right? Early 20th century. But then we do existential readings all the time, right? Because it's about human existence. Similarly, you can look at postmodern approaches to something that is not 20th century or 21st century also possible. Yeah. So I'm really envious of all of you. You are all so active, and I want to be in this auditorium. I feel so distant from all of you here. I can see Femina there, finally. Yeah.
Ma'am, how are you, ma'am?
Hello, I'm good. How are you?
Yes, ma'am, fine, ma'am. It went on very well. We were following you, but you were checking often.
I was getting, I'm so sorry. I was getting, you were not able to see me?
Ma'am, I could see you, ma'am. No,
Okay,
you were checking often whether we were following you.
Checking often. Okay. Yeah, I have to, right?
Yes.
That's what we teachers do.
We
We
were
need to.
following you all through, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you so much. See, my only concern is postmodern is a very, very abstract concept, right? I just want to make sure students understand it in very simplified terms. That's all.
Yes, ma'am. You even gave many examples, so we were able to be with you.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
Hello, Sushma. I'm Dr. Manimekal. It's the first time now
Yes, ma'am.
on listening to you. I'm very much impressed. Being personally feminist trained or a person who resists against being subjugated as a female.
Yeah.
I'm happy that I'm with you.
Oh, thank you so much, ma'am. We need that solidarity.
Yeah, solidarity.
Yes.
We share solidarity. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Are you part of the department there?
Part of the department, I am the chairperson.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Thank you so much. I didn't know. It's been a long time since I came to Kalishwari, right? 3 years. So
No, I was not there. When you came over to Kalishwari, I was not there. But right now I see an alter ego in me. An alter ego in me. In you.
oh,
Yeah.
okay. That's really nice. So sweet, ma'am. Thank you.
Good morning, ma'am.
Yes.
This is V. Maria Christina from Sri Kalishwari College.
Yes.
It's just a comment, ma'am. I don't have any question. Actually, we understood your section very well, ma'am. You have talked about postmodernism and transdisciplinary. It was a wonderful section. We have a clear-cut idea of what is postmodernism and transdisciplinary, especially in gender, queer theory. I have taught so well, ma'am, and your literature was so good, and your language is so good, and you're looking so beautiful, ma'am, and thank you for this.
Thank you so much. I mean, I have an identity crisis because I'm using these glasses from a few days now. I feel really old. So thank you for that. I think there is something in the chat box. Okay. I think Suraj says she will let me know his text. Okay, I'll share my email ID. I'll just post it here. I think Vinod has a question. I have one doubt. Can you explain eco-criticism? Very, very interesting. Yeah. See, I told you that to a large extent, the modernist period was a period which kind of celebrated technology, right? Because if you look at the early 20th century, there was so much of technological advancement. And that was also the time when a lot of nations became decolonized, right? There was a lot of nation building, nation formation, and the relationship between technology and war, science and war, especially during the Holocaust, during the Nazi regime, right? And you also know that most of the modern cities were developed in the early 20th century. So there was a tendency to celebrate this late capitalist, understanding of technology as something very utopian. In fact, the city was seen as a very utopian space, as a progressive space. And you know what happens when cities are built, right? A lot of ecology is destroyed. A lot of ecosystems are, compromised in order to create cities and urban spaces. So this modernist idea of progressive technology is something that eco-criticism has been questioning for a really long time. So if you look at a lot of literature today, a lot of literature goes back to folklore, native traditions. A lot of post-colonial literature, which we call as new literatures, looks at the indigenous, the tribes, right? So whether it is Canadian literature or Australian literature or American literature, so there is a lot of focus on the native the Native Indian and Native American, as well as in India today, we are looking at the Northeastern literature, right? And the emphasis, on ecological diversity, eco-sustainability, ecofeminism. A lot of post-colonial literatures today is looking at ecology, right? And to me, this is a very postmodern approach because it questions this, modern idea of progressive rationalism and late capitalism, right? So I think, you can look at a lot of different writers who look at ecology in literature, and you can do a postmodern reading, right? It's very much possible. I hope I have answered your question. Or you can look at native, folklore performances, visual art. For example, you can look at native cultures, their paintings. For example, even something like their totems, their festivals. One of my students is looking at, she, for her MPhil, she looked at the Kuruba community in Karnataka and one of their festivals, right? And this was, and now she's doing her PhD. She's looking at the Yellamma Devi tradition. One of my scholars, Yashasvi. This is from the English department. She's looking at the Yellamma Devi, Jatra that happens in North Karnataka in Savadatti, North Karnataka every year. It's an annual festival. So as literature students, you can go back to folk traditions, you can go back to folk narratives, you can go back to indigenous systems of knowledge, right? Don't confine yourself only to literary texts that are printed. Today, I think you all have reached a stage where everything is a text. That's why I ended with Derrida. Everything is a text. A space is a text. Architecture is a text. Cultural practices are text. So don't be limited only by your traditional classical understanding of literature. Only then you can become postmodern. Yes, Amitav Ghosh. Yes, definitely. In fact, I was looking for his name. It didn't come to me. Amitav Ghosh is a very, very important, I would say, postmodern, writer who looks at ecological discourses. Have I answered your question, Vinod? Abhijit, thank you for that input about Amitav Ghosh. I'm sorry, I don't know your designations and where you're from. I'm just calling you by your first names. I hope that's okay.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now I call Dr. S. Manimekalai, Associate Professor, Department of English, Kalishwari College, to recapitulate the session with a concluding remark.
Good morning, Sushma. Good morning, audience. The outset, I'm really very happy to be associated with the feminism specialist, Sushma Murthy. Because myself, personally speaking, I am feminist trained, and I never allow myself to be subjugated by anybody just because he is biologically male, whether in personal relationships or professional. I never consider my husband superior just because he is a male. At the same time, even in professional relationships, I never consider myself inferior to the principal of the college, who happens to be a male. Okay, if you are intellectually superior, I bow down, but not your biological maleness. Okay, I firmly believe in it and I advocate it to my students' community. So I'm personally very happy that I'm associated with Sushma, who is a feminism specialist, because she teaches gender studies and her doctoral dissertation is on the burnished feminines, lesbian aesthetics, and then her research interest includes feminist translation studies, psychoanalytical feminism, and trauma narratives by women. And now she has taken a major research project on a prominent psychoanalytical feminist writer, and she examines the psychocultural aspects of women's mental health disorders. So, she is a typical feminism specialist. And as you all know well, her representation was really an insightful and exhaustive study on postmodernism and feminism. Where at the outset she said her presentation would be on 4 points. The first is from Kant to deconstruction. The second is productive differences. The third is the genealogies and subjectives. And then hyperreality, cyborg. And first she traced the concept of postmodernism as in relation to modernism. So modernism found its place in the early 20th century when the world began reeling from the devastation of the First World War and the Great Depression. Of course, there was the devastation of the First World War and the world around was chaotic and fragmented, but still the modernists attempted to find and create a meaning. They wanted to impose orderliness on chaos. They believed in the progress. They believed in order. They believed in progress. They believed in order and progress, as we see in structuralism, expressionism, or impressionism that believed in orderliness. But you understand, the modernism believed in orderliness. That's what she said. Epistemological, which believed in being systematic, which believed in being orderly. To them, knowledge is fixed. Knowledge is unchanging. As you have taken them from meta-narratives. Understand? That is what she was trying to make clear. Modernism is epistemological, which considers knowledge as fixed and unchanged. As they offer you knowledge through meta-narratives on science. These are the rules for history, so this is history. These are the rules for science, this is science. This is how love is to be. This is how romance is to be. This is what the meta-narratives teach you. And this is modernism. Okay? But the movements that followed modernism in the second half of 20th century till today, they don't believe. They say that knowledge is experiential. Knowledge is ontological, experiential. Okay? Love is not something as fixed, as narrated by the meta-narratives. Love is experiential as you experience it. Okay? As you experience romance, as you experience love, that is love and romance. Okay? Not dictated by the meta-narratives. That is postmodernism. Postmodernism that developed after structuralism. Okay? Structuralism, the end of naturalism was the birth of postmodernism. Okay? The end of orderliness, the end of belief in progress. Okay? That is postmodernism, which was born by the mid of the 20th century or by the end of the 20th century. Of course, after the devastation of the Second World War, they considered, of course, they saw the world. They saw the post World War II world as naturally fragmented, chaotic, neurotic, nonsensical, obscure, ambiguous, as against being absolute. But whereas the modernism lamented over the chaotic world, postmodernists accepted it, they celebrated it, they embraced it, okay, without any fear, without any illusions, and they could celebrate it with dark humor and fun. வாழ்வே மாயம் தாய் கொண்டு வந்ததை தாலாட்டி வைத்ததை தீ கொண்டு போனதம்மா. This is modernism, lamenting over it. Okay, வாழ்வே மாயம் இந்த வாழ்வே மாயம். This is modernist voice. Okay, postmodernist voice says போனால் போடா இந்த பூமியில் நிலையாய் வாழ்ந்தவர் யாரடா. This is postmodernism. You understand the difference? Both live in the chaotic world. They lament over the condition of being nothing. The postmodernists celebrate the condition of being nothing. Okay, they could do it with the great fun and humor. There are differences, as I said, modernist the wastelands. Where he ends the poem with Dartha, Dayatvam, Damyata, Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. He believes in progress. Now there is chaos, but there is a ray of hope. There is a ray of hope for progress. But the postmodernist, as you see in Vedic Pagoda, okay, life is directionless, life is meaningless, life is obscure, life is nonsensical, life is senseless. But let me accept it. We enjoy the game. What we enjoy the game? Why should I look for a ray of hope for progress, for order? Okay, this is postmodernism. So it's very beautifully Sushma. How postmodernism is markedly different from modernism. Okay, this is what she said, and then she related postmodernism to feminism. Of course, postmodernism is against the objectiveness. What do you mean by objectiveness? Is saying fixed things, believing absoluteness, the absolute truth of being good and bad. This is goodness, this is badness, this is highness, this is lowness, this is fact, this is fiction, this is modernism. But the postmodernist says there is no fixed concept, there is no absolute, there is no fixed concept about being low or being high, being bad or being good. Anything and everything can be decentralized and dislocated. Okay, the colonizer, it is a fixed concept that the colonizer's culture is high, the Western culture is high, the colonized culture is low. But look at the post-colonized literature, an offshoot of postmodernism. It can at any time be dislocated. Okay, the colonizer's culture, the colonizer's religion, which is considered high. Okay, it is decentralized, and then it is dislocated with the colonizers in Africa. Okay, the tribal religion, the tribal culture. Okay, the native culture versus outside culture and religion. When there is a collision after postmodernism, they say that the Western culture need not always be high. Okay, my tribal religion, my tribal culture can at any time dislocate the Western culture, and it can take its place. Okay, so that is what when postmodernism and feminism is concerned. In modern feminism, okay, it is fighting for the equal rights of men with women. But postmodernism says that why do you use gender? Why do you use gender as a fixed term? As a fixed term, because say experiences are not objective. Experiences are subjective, personal. Okay, you say that women are subjective, but what you say is that women's experiences are not universal. The experience of a black woman may be different from the experience of a white woman. The experience of a woman as a homemaker may be different from the experience of a woman as a professional. So don't say objective. Don't say that woman's experience is absolute, and don't ground all your claims on gender as objective. Okay. The second thing is, she says, the gender is not decided by biology. The postmodernism focuses, gender is not decided by biology. Gender is decided by the society and the culture. Okay, when somebody is called a transgender because he or she is not able to perform as the society expects her or him to be. That is why it calls her a transgender. Okay, I perform as a woman as the society expects me to do. As she said, I wear jewelry, I wear beautiful sarees, I wear flowers. Okay, this is what the society expects me to do as a woman. So I am labeled a woman. Okay, so the second tenet of postmodernism is, the first is a woman's experience. Any experience, don't call experiences universal. They are objective. they are subjective, or the experiences of all the women are not the same. Okay, they are personal. Every woman's experience is personal. Okay, and modernism calls it as universal, so postmodernism rejects it. The second thing it says, the woman's experience is not, it is a woman is, the gender is not decided by biology, but it is decided by the society and the culture. So the postmodern focuses on the societal and the cultural approaches to gender. The third is, what he says is, the feminism is not exclusively for women. Okay, it is for anybody who is affected by the gender issues. Gender issues. Okay, that is why they include the transgender and the queer studies. Okay, so she had made the picture of feminism in postmodernism, in the postmodernist perspective. She made it very clear. And then she said, next what she said is, how postmodernism breaks down the meta-narratives. How postmodernism breaks down the meta-narratives. Okay, the meta-narratives may come in the form of, as she said, Wilson Good novels or the Hollywood movies, which gives you, first of all, you understand the concept of meta-narrative. Meta-narrative and the grand narrative is the narratives that offers you fixed concepts, structured concepts, either about love or romance, or about history or science. But she says, postmodernism destroys, deconstructs, breaks down the meta-narratives, the structure, the fixed ideas, because she said everything is discursive. Okay, according to the meta-narratives, everything is straight. This is good, this is bad, this is high, this is low. But everything is discursive. Okay, he does not, that's what even yesterday Dr. Ravichandran said. This follows the rhythmic, it is rhythmic. No beginning, no end. It doesn't have a tree-like structure. Okay, there is a root, there is a branch, there is a stem, there is a branch. This is tree-like structure. Okay, this is what is the meta-narrative. The postmodernism follows the rhythmic structure. No end, no beginning, no end. Okay, because everything is discursive. Okay, this is the next point that Sushma pointed out. She said how postmodernism really is centered on ontology, not in epistemology. Epistemology is the system of knowledge. Okay, it is the system of knowledge. Knowledge is a system. That is epistemology. But according to postmodernism, knowledge is experience. Knowledge is experience. Okay, I don't call you somebody is good, somebody is bad. Don't say she is what I experience her to be. Okay, if she is good to me, she is good. If she is bad to me, she is bad. There is no fixed label that she is good, she is bad. Okay, she is beautiful, she is ugly. No. Okay, in beauty, little depends on the beauty lies in the beholder's eyes. This is the concept of postmodernism. Okay, there is no fixed concept about beauty. Beauty lies in the beholder's eyes. Okay, so how the epistemology versus ontology, that also she makes very clear. Then transdisciplinarity. Trans means trans. Trans is transcending. Transcending. Don't confine yourself with the boundaries. With the boundaries. Okay, that is disciplinarity. Disciplinarity. And then she illustrated transdisciplinarity with a beautiful short story from partition narratives, throwing the twins into the river and to be killing the other, to kill the other, to prove your identity. Okay, and the transdisciplinary concept also brought very clear by Sushma. Then she talked about transgender aesthetics. Transgender aesthetics with a special reference to Kalki Subramaniam but I haven't seen her performance. She said she's an activist, she's an artist, but so far, I have not seen her performance, and I will get to know even the title of the book by Kalki Subramanian. Kalki Subramanian. Okay, so she again she says she made a reference to what Kalki Subramanian said. Okay, Kalki Subramanian says that this is breaking down the meta narratives. Okay, there are the societal construct, meta narrative or the societal construct. The society defines a woman in certain terms. Okay, I must be able to produce a child. I must be able to feed a child. Okay, so this is what the social construct, according to meta-narratives or according to the society, this is what a woman is. But Kalki Subramanian says that no, I cannot produce a child. I cannot feed a child, but at the same time, I am a woman. I am a woman. Okay, I am a woman, and the surgery of my genital, it has given me nirvana, and I am a woman. I am a woman, and so the womanhood need not be defined through the social construct and the Mahashweta Devi's short story Yasoda. So it's breast. The short story is breast and beautiful. Deconstruction of motherhood. Okay, deconstructing the caste, deconstructing the there is motherhood, but she was not feeding the children that she had produced. Okay, she conceives, she becomes a wet nurse. Okay, and she feeds the other children. Okay, there is a deconstruction of the social construct of motherhood. It was a real beautiful illustration. It's a very beautiful illustration. And last she was talking about, this is the concept I was not so familiar with, from the cyborg, okay? The postmodern identity. Okay? My identity, Dr. Madhuri, is not only a woman, okay? Half animal, half male or female, half technology. This is my identity. This is again deconstructing the meta-narratives, deconstructing the concept of identity given by the meta-narratives. Okay, so on the whole, you get a very clear picture. Maybe right from the first session last morning, and of course we have been talking about postmodernism. As she said, postmodernism is not a movement. You can define romanticism as a movement. You can define classicism as a movement. Your classicism is a movement. There are characteristic features. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You write the characteristic features of every movement. But postmodernism is not a movement. It's not a movement. Okay? It is an approach. Postmodernism is an approach. Okay? Because there are multiplicity of disciplines goes into postmodernism. So postmodernism is an approach that doesn't believe in absoluteness, that doesn't believe in absolute truth, that doesn't believe in the absoluteness of binary. Okay, that doesn't believe in the absoluteness of the dichotomy, the binary. They don't believe in epistemology, fixed concepts, structured concepts. Okay, it is based on ontology, that everything is discussing. Anything can change. Which is high today can become low tomorrow. Which is true today can become fictitious tomorrow. Okay, this is what is conveyed to magical realism. The binaries between fact and fiction is broken through magical realism. Okay, the main focus of you read Salman Rushdie. He is the father of postmodernism and magical realism. fictitious. Okay, midnight children are the children who are born on the midnight of India's independence, the special moment. And the children born at that special moment are blessed with special qualities. And the protagonist of the novel Silent Sinai, he has the telepathy. He can smell emotions. He can smell emotions. Okay, and then he is used as a sniffing dog. Sniffing dog in the Pakistan army. Okay, he can sniff. What is the sniff? The knife and the open eye. Sniffing dog is open eye. Yeah, man being used as a sniffing dog. No, it is fictitious. But the way another midnight child, he doesn't have hermaphrodite. He doesn't belong to any gender. By getting into a tube, he can either become a male or he can become a female as he decides. This is also fictitious. But the way Salman Rushdie describes it, the boundaries between magic and realism is broken. You start believing that this is real. Okay, this is not magical, this is real. So the main point is breaking down the boundaries. Breaking down the boundaries, that's a special feature of postmodernism. Okay, I can really thank Sushma for giving a very insightful and exhaustive presentation on postmodernism and feminism. And personally, I thank her for introducing me to Kalki Subramanian. I would like to read on her and I would like to read the book by Kalki Subramanian. And the next is for cyber. So what? I'm not familiar with the cyber concept. Okay, everyone's postmodernist identity is half animal, half male or female, half technology. Okay, this is identity. There is no absolute identity of you as a woman, as a man. Okay, every man's postmodernist identity is half male or female, half animal, half technology. This is something interesting. So personally, on behalf of the audience, on behalf of Arvind Kalishwari, I thank Sushma for an insightful and interesting presentation on postmodernism and feminism. And personally, I thank her for introducing me to the cyber concept, which is Altrada, which I have yet to learn. Thank you so much, Sushma. And personally, I'm very happy that I'm associated. Thank you.
Thank you for your valuable feedbacks. Here, I cordially and blissfully welcome our principal, the captain, and the pillar of our ship, motivator, superior, and inspirational person, Dr. S. Krishnamurthy, to distribute the certificates to the participants. Christina, line 9, get certificates. Esther. Anyone representing the Exeter College? Anyone representing the Exeter College? Hey, Kumar. From Major College. From Major College.
It creates love. The root of all goodness lies in the soil of appreciation. I would like to call Dr. S. Shanti, Assistant Professor, Department of English, to propose a vote of thanks.
Good evening to everyone. Respected dignitaries on the dais and off the dais, invitees, participants, and dear students. I am feeling honored to get this opportunity to conclude the two-day national level conference on postmodern voices and transdisciplinarity in English language and literature, organized by the Department of English, joint hands with the Indian Society for the Promotion of English Language and Literature, ISPEL. Organizing a national level conference is a highly challenging task. This cannot be possible without the great help from various people, support from every corner, and blessing. Now it is time to convey our gratitude to all those who extended their support and made this event successful. First of all, I am thankful to God Almighty for giving courage and spirit to organize this two-day national level conference. At this juncture, and on the behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to express our profound gratitude to our magnanimous secretary, Sri A.P. Selvararajan sir. Without the generous financial support from them, it would not be possible to organize this grand two-day national level conference. I extend my gratitude to our honorable, respected principal of our institution, Dr. S. Krishnamurthy sir, for his exceptional leadership guidance and motivation behind in all our academic endeavors. Thank you, sir. I extend my gratitude to our respected Vice Principal, Dr. P.K. Balamurugan sir and Muthulakshmi madam, and for their moral support and guidance. I would like to recall our deep sense of obligation to our collaborative team members from ISPEL. I thank them immensely for joining with us. On behalf of organizing committee, our sincere thanks go to all the invited plenary session speaker, session chairs for the two-day national conference. Dear participants, our words may not be capable to express our sense of gratitude to our valedictory session guest of honor, Professor M. R. Chandran, Head and Associate Professor, Center for Research in English, Saraswati Narayan College, Madurai. Thank you, sir, for sharing your profound knowledge with us. I request the audience to give a huge round of applause to all of the reporters. I'm happy to welcome and Dr. Manimekarai Madam, Associate Professor and support. Madam, you both have given your valuable time in fixing many resources related to this conference. Thank you, ma'am. I convey my sincere thanks to our beloved head of the department, Dr. S. Chandra. Thank the delegates from various institutions who have joined from different regions across the country to participate in this conference. Thank you for coming here. I take this opportunity to thank all the revivers, technical team members for helping us endlessly. Thank you for the support. I express my gratitude to the department colleagues, coordinators, organizers for their dedication and support to make this conference a grand success. I thank So, in last but most important, a special thanks go to all the student volunteers who have worked. Special thanks to our elementary student Hariharan and Surya Prakash who have come over to support us. Thank you.
Thank you, madam. The two-day national conference on postmodern voices and transdisciplinarity in English language and literature reaches its final destination. The presence of dignitaries and impressive lineup of scholars from across the nation, an array of carefully selected, well-researched and well-presented papers on the subject, all came together to help us admirably conclude this huge endeavor, the two-day national conference. Thank you so much for your response and active participation. We look forward to meeting you all again in the forthcoming events. Thank you all once again. Ask you to rise up for national anthem. Thank you.